Welcome to WITA's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. Imagine our speakers are sitting at a local pub after a tough week at the office or at the negotiating table, downloading with their colleagues about the latest developments in international trade. That's what we aim to bring you with WITA's Friday Exchange. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify to be the first to know when they go live. Today, we're bringing the band back together for the Exchange podcast to share some truths about what's been happening on trade the past few hours, days, weeks, and where we think things may be headed in the weeks to come. We're recording this week's episode on Friday, September 26th at 9 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So depending on when you download and listen, the trade issues we're discussing today may have changed. And in fact, if we had recorded this yesterday, things would have changed. So welcome back to the Exchange, to the Fab Four. Wendy Cutler, Asia Society Policy Institute, and the former Acting Deputy United States Trade Representative. Dan Mullaney, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the former assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Europe and the Middle East. Mark Linscott, senior advisor at the Asia Group, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and the former assistant U.S. Trade Representative for South and Central Asian Affairs. And our moderator and discussion host today, Joe DeMond, chair of international trade policy and global life sciences at Crowell Global Advisors, and a former deputy assistant USTR for Asia. Joe?
And good morning, Wendy, Dan, and Mark. Before yesterday, there already probably wasn't a shortage of things to talk about, but now there's even less of a shortage because all of us probably had prepared yesterday afternoon for this discussion, only to find out last night that the president issued or yesterday evening, the president issued three new Truth Social statements that had the effect of setting policy on some sectoral trade initiatives, those being pharmaceuticals, furniture, and trucks. These relate to ongoing investigations in those sectors. People have been awaiting some sort of word on all of them. In addition to which, by the way, the president announced some new sectoral trade tariff initiatives earlier this week. These are called Section 232 investigations on robotics and medical equipment. But let's start with the news from last night because it actually gives us some information about where the administration is going. Let's start with pharmaceuticals. And if you don't mind, I will start a little bit here because I have a lot of background in the pharma sector, I think, as people know. So first of all, just to set the ground as to what happened, there was an investigation on pharmaceutical imports. The announcement by the president last night was focused on what they call patented or branded pharmaceuticals. Just that. So not generics, which is a lot of that's the bulk of our importation from, say, China and India are generic products. The bulk of the patented, or there are some patented type from China and India, but primarily from other high-income countries such as the EU or Switzerland or Australia. And interestingly, so what the president said for those kinds of products, 100% tariff starting October 1st, unless the companies importing them, now this is by company, demonstrates that they're manufacturing or have plans to manufacture in the United States. So first question is, what does that mean? Because having been in the industry a long time, I don't see any new decisions on manufacturing coming out before October 1st. So to be given a week's notice on something like that is interesting. But the second question is, it just raises a lot of other technical questions too. Do you have to be producing every single product in the United States? Because, these companies make a lot of different products. They all manufacture in the U.S., all the major big pharmas who make even European and Japanese ones manufacture in the U.S., but they don't make every product in the U.S. How is that all going to work? So those are the questions, and I'm interested to get some initial take from the three of you on what you think is going on. Who wants to start?
Well, I can maybe just start with a few comments here, and thanks, Joe, because you are really the expert here, and I never really thought about product by product here. I mean, one thing I could just say off the top of my head, reading the Truth Social statement, is that if I were a pharmaceutical company now, I'd be sending my staff to Home Depot to buy a lot of shovels and stick them in the ground and claim that you are now breaking ground on new investments. So maybe you would be qualify for an exception.
And maybe pick up some kitchen cabinets while they're there.
Exactly. Before October 1.
Yeah.
But
and you can drive them all back in a heavy truck, to your site. So,
but one thing, this October 1 implementation date is very soon, and we have not seen anything official on this at all, just a Truth Social announcement. So I'm skeptical that this can be implemented by October 1. There's so many implementation questions out there. I would also note that the EU and Japan, in their agreements with the U.S., have kind of locked in a 15% tariff under the 232. So a combination of that of a lower tariff for the EU and Japan, as you mentioned, two big importers of pharmaceuticals to the U.S., coupled with what looks to me like a broad exception for U.S. companies, but you're absolutely correct, it depends how it will be implemented, suggests that the scope and the impact of this 100% tariff may not be as great as, we're all assuming, because it's a big number. And frankly, if you look at the other 232s that have been announced, this is, I think, the highest tariff to date for the pharmaceuticals at 100%.
Just on a couple of points on that, Wendy, too, and Dan, Mark, interested in getting your thoughts. You make a great point about the EU deal, and I think the UK also has a language that says that they can get preferential treatment on their imports. But just again, from my knowledge of the landscape here, a lot of those imports, maybe most of them, for the patented area that we're talking about here, come in from Ireland, which is in the EU. So that has a 15% tariff. So right away, a big segment of what we're talking about here is not even covered. And a lot also come from, as you pointed out, Wendy, from the UK and from Japan. So those aren't even covered. So who's left? I mean, there is Switzerland.
Well,
and there's Australia. So, and there's some that come in from both of those.
Yeah, Switzerland is very big in pharmaceuticals, and I think one of the things coming out is one of the things that occurred to me is that the value of having done a deal versus not doing a deal has probably gone way up. So at one extreme, you have Switzerland with no deal, and I guess they got the 100% unless there's construction. At the other end, you have the EU, which already had a deal for zero tariffs on generic pharmaceuticals and now a 15% cap for the other pharmaceuticals. And then in the middle, you have the UK, which, as you said, has some provisions about a preferential rate in light of 232 outcomes, but not very specific. What's interesting about that is, of course, all of these frameworks are, kind of starting points for further negotiations, a lot of which have to do with other regulatory barriers and things like that. So I think, for the UK and maybe some other countries, including the EU, which are starting these other further discussions on the framework, whether this 15% cap, say, applies to the UK, may depend in part on how well those other negotiations are going with respect to other elements of the framework agreement. Because, the tariffs are the element that get all the attention, but there are a huge number of non-tariff barriers and other issues in those agreements. And if those don't go well, those discussions, I wonder, what the likelihood is of getting something like the 15% cap on the pharmaceuticals. But the overall message is, I think, probably for the EU, which has been going back and forth a little bit about whether this was a good idea to make a deal with the United States or whether they should have retaliated. And I think probably the pro-deal people maybe got a bit of boost in the arm from this 232 announcement.
Yeah, and I want to raise 2 points on the announcement yesterday. And we all saw this coming for weeks and longer. We've been talking about it here on this program. week after week that we've got these pending 232s. We anticipate that there will be tariffs, and they are coming relatively soon. But still, when it happens, it's a bit shocking. I mean, it still kind of leaves you breathless in terms of, what are the impacts? I mean, there's, as Wendy noted, there's been nothing released. There's no investigation report that's been released. There's no suggestion of any opportunity to comment on the proposed. It's not a proposed tariff, it's a definitive tariff, but to comment on the impacts of it. So, it still is, they catch us off guard in many respects. And that's the unpredictability that is the one feature, I think, the one prominent component of this Trump trade policy, that it's going to be unpredictable. On the pharmaceutical side, I've got questions in the India context. So, Joe, you are the expert. But I just got a text from a colleague that said, yeah, generics basically excluded, and that's what India exports for the most part. But there are also a category of branded generics. So I wonder about that. And, India does export some branded generics.
That category, now we're getting a little technical, but yeah, I mean, that definitely occurred to me when I read it, because it says patented or branded. So if they're used as a synonym for each other, which sometimes they are, then that's not going to be a problem for India. But there is such a thing as a branded generic, where it has a name, even though it's a generic molecule name. And again, this goes back to Wendy's point. We just don't know. I mean, until there's an EO out, and I don't think there's any way to know. The other thing I would just want to say about this and these other decisions is, I mean, tell me if you share this, is like, as you point out, Section 232 requires an investigation. We haven't seen a report on that yet. But not to be too cynical, but you get the strong sense that the investigation's going on over here by the bureaucracy, which, we have good public officials who know how to do these things. But then you get a decision made over here, House, that is or is not at all connected to what the investigation actually is. And I get the sense that these are two different things, especially when, like we go to furniture, just for one sec. That is an outgrowth of a 232 case that started on lumber.
Right.
Okay, not furniture. And by the way, this furniture includes upholstered furniture. What does that have to do with lumber, right? So the president just decided a couple weeks ago in another Truth Social post that this investigation was going to somehow now include furniture. And he, in his previous Truth Social, he said because we want to reinvigorate furniture manufacturing in South and North Carolina, which were traditional U.S. The centers of furniture manufacturing. So you get the sense that something came in from the outside. We can speculate to what that might have been, but there's probably some advocacy going on there. And then the president, all of a sudden, now he's focused. And by the way, what happened to the rest of the 232 case, the lumber that it was originally supposed to be? So again, I get this strong sense that this is being driven by, political type imperatives at the White House specifically, and that the investigations, which are normally what drives these things, aren't really doing that. I don't know if you
can I just add, I think the reach and the scope of these 232s is just growing and growing. As you mentioned, Joe, there are two new investigations. There are a number of other investigations on semiconductors and drones and critical minerals that are expected to pop out soon. And I was struck by a figure published by our close colleague, Ed Gresser. His institute now says that up to a third of U.S. manufactured imports are now covered by Section 232. I assume he's also referring to the unfinished investigations, but I'm not exactly sure. But I just want to put on the table, Section 232 has become the tool after IEEPA for imposing tariffs. And if IEEPA indeed is ruled down by the courts, I would expect the 232s to even become more robust, and the number of them, but also the coverage, because we haven't really discussed yet, but in further podcasts we have this whole idea of covering derivative products. And maybe you could argue some of those kitchen cabinets are derivative of wood, but the steel coverage just keeps getting broader and broader to a point where it's affecting a lot of consumer goods now.
Well, and then the big question on that is semiconductors, right? Because a derivative of a semiconductor product is any product that has a semiconductor in it, which is everything we buy. It's iPhones, Samsung phones from Asia, everything, computers. We don't know if it's just going to be semiconductors or how far downstream it's going to go on that. That's potentially huge.
I mean, I'm really glad Wendy raised that point, because it was central for me too. We may now see execution of a plan B. That anticipating the possibility that the Supreme Court will shoot down the tariffs under IEEPA, and they've got to scramble for other authorities to impose tariffs, and that is happening even before the Supreme Court decision. I mean, the scope being potentially anything, and I think that's going to upend every single negotiation. Those on deals that have not yet been struck, so India being in that category, but potentially those that have been struck. I mean, you were talking about the EU and Vietnam. I mean, we have not yet seen anything on Vietnam. We had an announcement of a deal, but
3 months ago.
Furniture's got to be a big issue for Vietnam. So it's almost like going back to square one to kind of restart some of these negotiations.
Well, and I got to say, I mean, with respect to Vietnam and these other countries, the EU and Japan had enough leverage, and still took a huge effort to get and work for months to get 232 cases included in the negotiation. And somehow they succeeded. They did succeed at the end of the day to do that. The other countries have not been so lucky. Mark, I don't know where India is on this, but I can tell you Southeast Asians are like nowheresville on this. And I don't know if the Koreans, have gotten anywhere on this, but the others have just been told no. Like you're going to give us all of this in the negotiation, and then this huge chunk of your trade. By the way, just to give Vietnam example, half of their trade is electronics. Another huge percentage is furniture, as you said. In fact, they're probably going to be the largest country hit under the sectoral tariffs, and they're being told, well, that doesn't count. Like that's going to be decided elsewhere. And the tariffs, by the way, in the furniture are much higher than the 20% reciprocal tariff that Vietnam has been given. So, that's a few $1 billion in trade of theirs, of exports of theirs, that is all of a sudden facing higher tariffs. Your point is spot on. But do we know? I mean, are other countries continuing to? This makes it all the more relevant, I think, that other countries asking these questions in negotiations. The Indians, the Koreans, the smaller countries. Like, well, what gives? I mean, what are we negotiating for here?
Well, I think my view is it's going to be harder and harder for these countries to rally domestic support for these agreements. And I think some of them may face some, political challenges and could be criticized politically for, reaching a deal with the U.S. only to find that other tariffs, they haven't been shielded from other tariffs. Maybe I can just touch on Korea for a minute. I mean, Korea did reach a deal in principle, but they have not been able to finalize that deal since the recent visit of the meeting between President Lee and President Trump. The big hangup in that negotiation is the U.S. request for this $350 billion investment fund, which mirrors the Japan agreement on a $550 billion investment fund. But Korea is basically saying, we can't do this. We don't have the reserves to do this. This is 20% of our GDP, et cetera. When they reached their agreement in principle, my understanding was they also thought they were getting that 15% 232 MFN shield that Japan got with respect to pharmaceuticals. pharmaceuticals and the other side, and semiconductors. But again, nothing's in writing. And you're seeing increasingly reports out of Korea that they may be better off with the 25% tariff then reaching a deal with the U.S., having to spend $350 billion, that it costs a lot less money for them just to support their domestic suppliers are being hurt by these tariffs.
Right, it's going to be a lot, yeah.
Than actually going forward with this fund. I don't think they've said no, but I think it's interesting. President Lee said, I could be impeached if I were to agree to this type of fund. So I'm wondering, and I'd ask Mark and Dan, do you see any other countries where this kind of domestic unrest regarding these deals may be rising, or do these 232s, just introduce a new element of uncertainty that may lead to more domestic opposition?
Before Dan, Mark, you answer, I just wanted to ask one question. Wendy, I was in Korea last week for some APEC meetings, and you know this, but maybe people here don't. The fallout of the Hyundai workers was all over the news. It's huge there, right? Huge political issue, and it seems to further constrain the Korean government's ability to do anything, because there's just this huge uproar. And I assume that's part of this equation for them.
Absolutely. And they're already saying that, their companies are now cautious about restarting these investment projects and committing to more. So yeah, this has not worked out at all. The U.S. has said that they're willing to work, find a solution with Korea on the visa issue. But I wonder if that can happen as quickly as a Truth Social post can happen.
Right. I'm sorry, Mark, I interrupted.
To Wendy's question and point, I do think that the 232 announcements have immediate impacts on ongoing negotiations and centrally India. I mean, that it's been, again, things are looking momentum. There's been some real positive developments. The two sides are negotiating on trade, which had been put on ice only a few weeks ago. They're ongoing again. Jameson Greer met with Goyal in New York. The negotiators are back at the table, and they had a lot
of commerce and industry.
Yeah, they had a lot to work with because they had already been very close to a deal. But, then today we've got, yesterday we've got this announcement. I think it does change the calculus a bit today, certainly on the Indian side. And even if much of the pharma exports from India are excluded, and I don't think all will be, they've got to negotiate that now, and they've got to negotiate it hard. And, it makes it there was a leak of the approach that's being considered on semiconductors and derivative products. And, that one is important for them. So, they probably have to really, work harder to try to get commitments on the 232s that are pending, ones that could come about in the future. And I think it makes the negotiation a little more complicated than they were perhaps a couple of days ago.
And how about the visa issue?
Well, there's that. They still have to resolve Russian oil. We had an exchange on this earlier. I think we're going to see over time a lot of unraveling of agreements that have already been struck, or unraveling of negotiations for agreements that may be imminent. And then it gets to the question of what is the objective of this Trump trade policy? Is it to use it as leverage to get market access in other countries? And it's been effective leverage. There's no doubt about that. But to what extent has it been misused in getting those commitments from other countries? Or is the central objective to just have tariffs? And to, basically have an autarkic approach on trade, to engage in import substitution like India did, back when it was a much more closed economy. I mean, is that the objective? And these trade deals, really aren't central to what they want going down the road, or do they not know? I mean, that's quite possible. That there are various schools of thought in the Trump administration, and there's really been no settling of what is the objective of this trade policy.
I mean, for the EU, that's a little bit fundamental, whether there's support for engagement under the theory that if you address some of the other issues that you may end up reducing the tariffs, or is the point just to maintain the tariffs in place? I mean, I think the support for engagement in the EU is a bit on a knife's edge. There are a lot of constituents who favored using the anti-coercion instrument or other forms of retaliation in lieu of doing a deal. And I think the decision on derivative products of steel was a big shock to the EU, because that, of course, is not covered by their deal, and that was a significant hit after the deal had been reached. And then in the announcements yesterday, they've announced a 232 on industrial machinery, which is, I think, a huge preoccupation of the EU, and in particular Germany. So I think the more that these 232s come into play, especially ones that aren't potentially capped by the 15% in the EU, and maybe the potential expansion into higher tariffs for other key products like industrial machinery, I think that that could make the kind of fragile consensus in favor of engagement with the United States and the EU. It could upset that balance. And I've heard slightly different tone from some of the commission officials who've talked about the deal, from saying this is a good deal, it's the best deal we could have gotten. This is what we need to do, which, as I said, is somewhat justified by this decision on pharmaceuticals. But there's a subtle shift, I think, more towards being critical about what can we do with these guys, and is there ever going to be reduction of tariffs in exchange for other concessions. I think there's a lot more doubt about that.
I would add, to some extent, right? The administration is. I think you raise a really important, interesting philosophical or policy-related question mark. But to some extent, the administration is having its cake and eating it too, right? They're getting to apply high tariffs, 15%, which used to be considered high, or higher, 20%, and get market access commitments by their trading partners. There's no world, right? I seem to agree that before this administration, there was no world in which the EU was going to agree to an agreement where the U.S. applied a 15% tariff and they had to make all these concessions, or Japan. But to some extent, that is working. Whether that's durable is I think another question. And the other thing I'd want to just raise, because I hear this again and again from some of the officials, the other potential objective here is, seriously, and I don't think a lot of policy people take this so seriously, it's to balance trade with each trade partner.
Yeah.
So the tariff is set, like that's one of the reasons some of the Asian countries with high trade deficits with the U.S., we're always going to be set at a higher rate, because the administration deems that that's the rate that's necessary to balance. So the objective could also be just, we want to balance trade on a bilateral basis with all of our major trading partners, which I think is a fool's errand, and it's not even clear what the benefit of that policy objective is necessarily. But so there are all these competing. It just adds to Mark's point that there are all these sort of competing objectives that, depending on who you talk to in the administration, you get different answers.
I think, Joe, that you're exactly right. I think that is a really important metric, is especially for the trading partners where we have large trade deficits, like the EU, like Switzerland. They're looking for that trade deficit to be reduced.
Yeah.
Before we leave 232s, just one comment on the industrial machinery one that Dan kind of, by raising it, it led me to just one thought, and that is, does the right hand know what the left hand is doing? Because if an objective of these tariffs is to bring manufacturing back to the United States, we are hurting U.S. companies manufacturing in the United States, for example, by the 50% steel and aluminum tariff. And many have said that has made them non-competitive with respect to autos coming in from Japan and Europe, which are now subject to a 15% tariff, but those companies don't have to pay the 50% steel tariff. I have a question on industrial machinery. Like, look, we don't know the coverage of this yet, but I'm assuming our companies need to buy imported machinery, at least in the short term, to help them build all this stuff and produce all the stuff that we want them to produce. But if, we're applying these high tariffs, are we then making them, by definition, non-competitive? So there just seems to be like a disconnect, in terms of all of these objectives. And are we shooting ourselves in the foot with some of these announcements?
Totally. And even in other policy areas, there's this somewhat incoherence. What I was going to say when we were talking about pharma, those of us who follow the pharma sector know the administration is pressing the industry super hard right now to lower the price of pharmaceuticals in the U.S. at the same time that they're applying 100% tariff on imports. So I just don't see how you could have it both ways, except that it's not really going to be 100% problem.
And there used to be, we as trade negotiators confronted it in other countries. There were many other countries, developing countries, that would, wanted to develop domestic manufacturing and hire in downstream domestic manufacturing, and they would engage essentially through their tariff schedule in a policy of tariff escalation. That was a term that we, trade policy geeks, use frequently. You have
it had a different meaning than it does now.
Yeah, you have low tariffs on inputs and higher tariffs on more sophisticated downstream products. So you can encourage imports of the cheaper inputs you need to be able to compete in the downstream products. Well, this has totally upended that notion. Yet, at least saying that the objective is make in America to bring manufacturing back to the United States. But but Wendy's exactly right. We're shooting ourselves in the foot by having tariffs across the spectrum on everything.
I mean, I think the long-term objective here, and it may be unrealistic. I think the Trump administration, I think, really admires in Germany their industrial base, their ability to do this high-end manufacturing, and especially machinery and things that we are a long way from being able to do. But I think the overall vision is we would like to be there. And so there's, I think, a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. Well, where do we want to be strong? Well, we really like the machinery sector in Germany. That's where we want to be strong. So let's put tariffs on those products so that we develop our own industry in that area. And of course, in the short term, that's totally unrealistic.
Germany itself is kind of reaching the end of that road, isn't it?
And we like the furniture industry in Vietnam, so we want to recreate that here as well, I guess.
That's the other thing. Let me raise one other question that I think has come up a bit, and just to get your take on this. And this has to go back to IEEPA again. Is the timing of so the Supreme Court's agreed to review the IEEPA tariffs. They're going to be hearing oral arguments in early November. Maybe a decision comes out by the end of the year. Maybe it doesn't, depending maybe on how the court is split and their agenda or their docket. Is this having any impact on? I think before we said maybe no, but do you think this having any impact on the tactics that countries are negotiating with the U.S., or is it just sort of not, because the administration has other tools here? But I still hear from countries, so maybe we should slow walk this, or maybe we should, we have to be mindful of the fact that the IEEPA tariffs could disappear. Any additional thoughts on that? Or
I mean, I think a lot of the counterparts that I've been talking to just assume that there will be some authority or some ability or some willingness to impose the tariffs regardless of what the Supreme Court does on IEEPA. So I think it's factoring in maybe as an element of doubt, but not very significantly. I don't think anybody, at least the people I talk to, they're not really changing their behavior in anticipation of a possible Supreme Court case striking down the tariffs.
Yeah. I share that sense. Part of me thought during my travels and discussions with our foreign trading partners that I'd hear about that more. But I think many are resigned to the fact that the administration will find one way or another to put in more tariffs. So again, probably on their minds, something they're watching, but not, I don't think in a major way changing their negotiating stance. But Joe, I'd ask you, because with respect to Southeast Asia, when Greer was in Malaysia this week, he did say something like, we're close to closing a whole host of agreements with a number of Southeast Asian countries. So do you sense in Southeast Asia they may be delaying a bit?
Yeah, this is interesting because, so first of all, USTR Greer went to the ASEAN ministerial meeting last week. Which is interesting because that's not something often the USTR will do. Sometimes they do, but there are no less. This is sort of again, we all feel empathy with our former USTR colleagues. There are no less than 8 negotiations in ASEAN going on between the United States, and the negotiators there have been instructed to try to complete them by the end of this year, and they have schedules, so they're and they're all staggered, but there will probably be 2 or 3 meetings for each of those, or negotiating sessions for each of those countries between now and the end of the year. And that deadline, I think, has some of them wondering if it is connected to IEPA, like why, like is the tactic, and maybe it's not, because again, maybe we're giving. I want to get your opinion on this. Is the tactic by the administration to get countries to make written commitments to open their markets, and then even if IEPA is overturned, the administration can still say, well, we're going to hold you to those written commitments because you made them to us, and we have other tools, by which to enforce them. And I think that's kind of the thought process that, do we want to put anything in writing? Because we might get held to it, even if the tariff authority disappears. And I don't know if that's a factor for anybody else, but I think these are countries, I think the distinction was just about the others we've discussed, India, Korea, that are still outstanding. They feel like they have very little leverage. So, and it's a very delicate balancing act, because you have one way to antagonize the administration, but on the other hand, you don't want to rush into necessarily an agreement. I think some of them have felt burnt by. Do you all remember way back when there was supposed to be a benefit to being sort of a first
mover? Yeah.
They don't remember that anymore.
Well, I wonder if the UK even remembers that.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. And then Dan, you mentioned earlier that so maybe IEPA itself is not the factor, but you've all mentioned already that there are some questions coming into negotiators' minds for other reasons, because of the 232s, because new demands keep being made even after you think you had a deal, or you have to then go even when you made a deal, they're not announcing it right away, as happened with Japan, because they want to still negotiate over the details of it, which are very important. That all those factors are causing kind of a slowdown in the process, in addition to the fact that now that you're getting into the real meat and potatoes of like non-tariff measures, those are, as we all know, difficult issues technically to resolve. So, what do you think, Dan? Is that happening in Europe?
I think there's an appreciation that these arrangements, these framework deals, are not like the old ones where it's like one and done. You've got a deal and now we're going to implement. They're like it's dynamic. I think the agreements for the EU and the UK, they did bring some amount of stability, although not as much as anybody would like. But we weren't talking about 200% tariffs. Well, maybe 100%. Well, maybe 300%. We've got some focal point on 15%, and so it's a little more stable now with respect to the tariffs. But I think they appreciate now the next step is all the other stuff Because, in the EU deal, 4 paragraphs are devoted to tariffs. And obviously those are the big items. They get a lot of attention, but there are over 10 paragraphs in the EU deal which focus on regulatory issues, regulatory barriers, things that are really very complicated to negotiate. And in the EU, there are also issues, regulations that create trade barriers, are also the regulations that fit into the EU's competition or competitiveness agenda, implementing the Draghi's competitiveness report. So they are looking to simplify some of these regulations. So I think what has started is maybe a certain amount of disenchantment, for sure, that there's not as much stability as one would like. But I think there's a recognition that now we have to start the difficult task of going into all these detailed regulatory barriers and seeing how those can be maybe removed and maybe used to increase EU's competitiveness. And the question is, in part, if you engage in that discussion in good faith, is there an opportunity then for further liberalization of the agreement, more zero sectors, lower tariffs? Is there a positive side to that engagement? So that's one question. Or, as Mark said, is the point tariffs? But there's another aspect to it, which is, and I think we will see this over the next few months. From now to the end of the year, our USTR colleagues are working really hard, and hats off to them, working really hard on all these really detailed, complicated regulatory barriers. And I think, as those discussions progress, and if they go badly, which, there are some signs that the EU and the UK are both resisting doing anything on regulations because of sovereignty or for whatever reason, if those things go badly, then you could have a negative side on the tariffs. So the next decision on 232, maybe it won't be capped. I mean, the UK still has this question, this implication that they're going to get preferential treatment on pharmaceuticals, but it's not in writing. And so, if those discussions don't go well, is there a discussion of the regulatory issues? If those don't go well, is there a downside in terms of the thing falling off the rails? And so I think that's going to be, I think we're going to have a lot of detailed, very steady, under the radar work on these regulatory issues. And depending on how those decisions go, that could affect how the bigger deal, including the tariffs, how that evolves.
Yeah. Dan, I've been meaning to ask you, we haven't talked about this, but you no doubt have been in probably a lot of events where this has come up. But to what extent is there a relationship between the trade issues and the security issues right now? I mean, the Europeans, obviously there's a land war going on in Europe. They need America's help and engagement. Trump made some movement in that direction. But does that give the U.S. a little bit extra leverage here?
Yeah, I mean, the flat out security military side, Ukraine, I mean, that definitely has an impact on what, Europe is doing with the United States broadly speaking. But there's also another factor, which is, I mean, the part of the European Commission's reorganization for this commission was to make the Trade Directorate trade and economic security. So there's an appreciation in Europe that a lot of the traditional economic issues do have an impact on security, and I think that's very much influencing how they view these discussions. And some of the provisions in these agreements talk about, supply chain security, and they talk about coordination vis-a-vis non-market economies in the context of security. So I think those two aspects, the flat-out military support for Ukraine aspect, and then the increasing overlap between economics and security, I think both those things are very much influencing how the U.S. and the EU are interacting.
Hey, before we close out, I do want to raise one issue which we've not yet touched on today, but I think is going to become increasingly relevant or potentially increasingly relevant. We've talked about political costs in other countries and how does that affect their impetus to try to strike these deals as quickly as possible. But what about political costs in the United States. And, this could be an issue that's even more important than what the Supreme Court decides on IEPA. I mean, so far, it doesn't look like there's a lot of support on tariffs. I mean, more on the Republican side, but, it seems pretty thin to me. And, we're getting kind of mixed economic data in terms of what are the impacts. I was just in Chicago, though, earlier this week. And, a lot of the questions I got were about, where is this trade policy going? Where are these tariffs going? For what reason? I mean, what's the objective here? There seems to be a lot of questions. And if there start to be some negative impacts, economic impacts associated with the tariffs, and they keep going up. I mean, it's got to happen at some point in time. Does that lead to a situation in which there are political costs for the administration, and does that lead to some kind of rejiggering of how they are approaching tariffs and negotiations with other countries? I mean, that's probably too big a question for us to address in the next minute or so. But it's something I think is could be a growing dynamic going forward.
I think that's the big question, right? I mean, so far, and maybe none of us would have expected this, the tariffs that have been applied have not had a huge impact, it seems, on the U.S. Economy. Although there are signs, right? Both with respect to prices going up and with respect to employment gains going down. And if that continues into the fall and into next year, and I think the other point is, can the point that it's because of tariffs be made to stick? Because Trump is going to, I think the administration will clearly try to blame this on the Fed for not lowering interest rates fast enough. And there will be a big debate if the economy starts to turn south about whose fault it is. I think tariffs will be viewed as being part of that. And maybe it depends on how it comes about and what sectors, but I think that is the big question heading into next year.
And the increasing cost of tariffs becomes apparent what maybe cause some in the administration to look for an exit ramp on some of these deals and maybe improve the deals under guise of, we've reduced the unfairness, we've solved the problem, so now we can lift some of these tariffs. It kind of potentially gives an excuse and an off ramp.
But my view is their strategy more is announce big numbers. Everyone focuses on that, and then just put in more and more exclusions and exceptions. So I think that's something also to watch. And, it's when you get like a Federal Register notice with like 50 pages of HS numbers of exclusions, like it's so hard to kind of go through that document. So people just assume, they kind of get the bang from that, because even, I don't know, I mean, Mark, the 50% tariff against India, that so far, and maybe, now with pharmaceuticals, it might change, but I've read somewhere that only impacts 53% of Indian imports into the United States.
It's having an impact, and it's only been in place for a short while, but there are sectors where it's clear there's going to be priority sectors in India. Textiles, definitely. Seafood products. I mean, they've got a lot of exports of frozen shrimp. I mean, they're down the road. I think electronics. That's have a real big impact. So. I think India is trying to get, and it's very difficult because of the situation that the administration created, and being particularly with letting Navarro unleashed to be, out there saying remarkable things. It's made it more difficult. But, I think India is trying to get now ahead of the game. Let's get this done. Even though that there are political costs, in India to do that, but they see that the impacts are significant. Maybe they will diversify and can diversify over time, but the immediate impacts are significant.
Okay.
And maybe, Joe, if I could just make one point we haven't touched upon, I'll be real quick, and this kind of to build on something that Mark just said. We have seen a lot of activity this past week, but in the past few weeks among our trading partners working together. So I'm just struck that the EU and India now have, after like 15 rounds of trade negotiations, multiple years, they're talking about finalizing their pact by the end of the year. The EU announced conclusion of an FTA with Indonesia. Singapore just concluded an agreement with EFTA on digital. We had Canada and Mexico meeting together to try and improve their relationship and coordinate in the lead up to the USMCA review. And we had Premier Li from China in New York meeting with business and other folks, and something we're not going to have time to announce, but he did announce that China will no longer avail itself to the special and differential provisions of the WTO. So there's a lot going on where we're not involved. And I think over time, this is going to come to bite U.S. Companies, U.S. exporters, and the workers that they employ, because we will lose our competitiveness vis-a-vis these other countries.
They should all be grateful. They should all be grateful to us that we're putting them all together. And
that's true.
We're making the impossible possible.
I think the bottom line is both the U.S. economy and then the structure of the world global system. This is kind of a slow burn, and it's taking place, like you said. It's going to another year be much clearer what the outcome has been and whether it's been good for the U.S. Also, by the way, are we actually creating manufacturing jobs in the U.S.? Because that's the big promise. So keep an eye on that number. And there's no escaping that one because they've hinged so much on it. Okay, we have talked and we can go on longer and longer, but I think we're exhausting our audience and ourselves. So we need to stop here. We'll continue this discussion, I'm sure, all the four of us in the future. And also there's other WITA emphasis every week that WITA puts this on. So let me just finish by saying this is Joe DeMond. Thanks for joining us, everybody. And we'll see you next time on WITA's Friday Exchange.
Thank you for watching and listening to WITA's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. New episodes drop every Friday, and you'll be the first to know. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with WITA's Friday Exchange.